On a sprawling 60-acre property in the picturesque village of South Newington, Oxfordshire, sat High Havens Farm, a seemingly tranquil estate nestled among rolling fields and ancient hedgerows. It was here that Anthony Southeran, a reclusive and vulnerable man, lived out his final days in circumstances that would later shock the nation. Outwardly, High Havens looked like the embodiment of English rural serenity. But behind its gates, a grim story was quietly unfolding, one that would end in betrayal, fraud, and eventually murder. This is Unmasked, where the truth doesn't wear makeup. Shocking and unbelievable, who cares? As long as it keeps you up at night, we're telling it. Let's get started. Anthony Southeran was not a public figure. Born in 1954, he had inherited considerable wealth, including the family estate, after the passing of his father. He lived in isolation, rarely leaving the farm, and avoided most social contact. Court records later described him as a vulnerable and isolated man, someone whose life was defined by routine and detachment from the outside world. Despite being over 6 feet tall, Anthony suffered from declining physical and mental health, making him increasingly dependent on others for basic needs. Those who knew him, few as they were, said he had little to no social circle and lived a quiet, reclusive life. By the early 2000s, Anthony had become almost entirely reliant on caregivers. His physical decline was slow but steady. He struggled with mobility issues and rarely went outside. His solitary existence made him susceptible to manipulation, an unfortunate vulnerability that would be exploited with devastating consequences. Much of Anthony's routine had revolved around his mother, Joy Southeran. Joy was a retired magistrate and school governor, widely respected in the Oxfordshire community. She had been a strong and active woman in her earlier years, but as she aged, she required care due to illness. In 2002, Linda Rickard was hired as Joy's live-in carer. It was a role that placed her at the heart of the Southeran family's private life. At first, there seemed to be no cause for concern. Linda fulfilled the expected duties, preparing meals, assisting with medication, managing household affairs. She was present, capable, and dependable, or so it appeared. Joy Southeran passed away in August 2012 at the age of 92. Her death marked a turning point in the dynamic at High Havens. Though her passing was not initially deemed suspicious, it created a vacuum, one that Linda Rickard quickly filled. Rather than leaving after her employer's death, Linda continued living at the estate, ostensibly to care for Anthony. Her presence soon extended beyond the role of a carer. She brought her husband, Wayne Rickard, to live with her on the property. Their continued residence raised few alarms at first. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a compassionate arrangement for a man in need of help. In reality, it marked the beginning of a long and calculated manipulation. High Havens was valuable, not just as a property but as a symbol of inherited privilege. With no immediate heirs involved in Anthony's day-to-day affairs and no frequent visits from legal professionals or medical personnel, it became an isolated microcosm, one where control could be quietly and gradually seized. Linda Rickard, who had already earned the family's trust through her service to Joy, now had unfettered access to Anthony's daily life, financial information, and medical care. Court evidence later revealed that Anthony's mental state continued to decline following his mother's death. A psychiatric assessment introduced at trial described him as someone whose comprehension and judgment were severely impaired. He was not mentally incapacitated to the extent that he could not make decisions, but his ability to recognize manipulation was limited. This deterioration was neither accidental nor unnoticed. According to forensic accountants and legal investigators, it was around this time that Linda began to forge documents and interfere with Anthony's estate planning. But in 2012, the extent of what was happening inside High Havens remained hidden. The house itself was secluded, surrounded by countryside and shielded by distance from curious neighbors. There were no urgent complaints, no frequent inspections. To the few outsiders who interacted with the Rickards, they appeared as caretakers of an aging man who simply preferred solitude. That appearance, however, was a facade, one that allowed the erosion of Anthony's autonomy to continue unchecked. It is important to underscore that at this stage, no alarms had been raised. Linda Rickard had spent years presenting herself as a competent and loyal carer. Her knowledge of Joy Sotheran's needs, routines, and medical history had earned her a level of trust that extended to Anthony. There was no formal oversight, no rotating roster of health workers, no legal professionals routinely involved in his affairs, and that absence of oversight would prove fatal. By the time of Anthony's death in 2014, the manipulation was complete. What was once still in motion, slow, deliberate, and undetected. Linda Rickard was already shaping the future through fraudulent legal documents and calculated isolation. The farm's gates remained closed to outsiders. Its rooms occupied by a man growing weaker by the day and a couple orchestrating a plan of financial and physical control. What began as a routine caregiving arrangement had transformed into something far more sinister. With Joy Sotheran gone, and Anthony increasingly unable to advocate for himself, the stage was set for one of the most shocking cases of coercive murder in recent British legal history. But no one could have imagined what was really happening behind the walls of High Haven's farm, or how long it would take for the truth to come to light. Before her name became synonymous with one of Britain's most disturbing cases of coercive murder, Linda Rickard lived a life marked by struggle, secrecy, and financial instability. Born in 1960, she was, by all outward appearances, an unremarkable woman living in Oxfordshire. But behind her composed demeanour was a deep well of desperation. By the time she arrived at High Haven's farm in 2006, her life was defined not by compassion, but by a mounting web of personal and financial troubles that would soon intertwine fatally with the lives of her employers. Linda was married to Wayne Rickard, a man who would later be described in court as complicit, though not at the architect of the crimes that unfolded. Together, they raised 4 children. But their family life was far from secure. Linda had a documented history of financial mismanagement. She had faced repeated economic hardship and a string of failed business ventures. Investigators later uncovered that she had debts and county court judgments against her name long before the Sotheran case began. She was not just financially vulnerable, she was actively looking for a way out. When Linda was hired in 2006 as a live-in carer for Joy Sotheran, she was stepping into the intimate life of an elderly woman with considerable means. Joy, a retired magistrate, was well known and respected in Oxfordshire. She had a strong personality and had lived a life of relative privilege. But with age and illness, she became increasingly dependent on others. Linda's role was to assist with daily care, managing medications, household duties, and companionship. Initially, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Linda was thoughtful and apparently loyal. She positioned herself as indispensable, taking on increasing responsibility and integrating herself into the Sotheran household. But what no one knew at the time was that Linda had begun subtly controlling access to Joy, filtering visitors, and managing communications. Her influence grew gradually but decisively. Joy Sotheran passed away on August 29, 2012. With her death, the last layer of protection around Anthony Sotheran, Joy's only son, disappeared. Linda, who had already built trust within the family, transitioned without pause into the role of Anthony's primary carer. No new professionals were hired, no oversight was introduced, and within weeks, Linda Rickard and her husband had moved fully into High Haven's farm. It was during this transition that the relationship between Linda and Anthony began to shift in disturbing ways. According to court testimony, Anthony's physical and mental health were in clear decline. He was heavily reliant on Linda for food, medication, and daily care. Experts later concluded that his cognitive state left him susceptible to suggestion, with limited ability to assess risk or manipulation. Under Linda's control, he became increasingly isolated. While Anthony remained confined to his room, Linda and Wayne occupied the rest of the property, enjoying the privileges of an estate they did not own. They managed the farm as if it were theirs, overseeing access, handling finances, and essentially cutting off Anthony without consent. Within that environment of isolation, Linda took full control of his medications, his contact with the outside world, and even his access to food. Wayne Rickard was not simply a passive bystander. He was present, aware of his wife's influence, and benefited from the arrangement. Though he later denied knowledge of the depth of Linda's actions, the court concluded he played a role in enabling the conditions that led to Anthony's death. By the end of 2012, Linda Rickard had inserted herself completely into the Southeran estate. The manipulation was not abrupt, it was systematic. It involved psychological control, medical restriction, and legal maneuvering. High Haven's farm had become the backdrop for a slow, calculated takeover. And behind the scenes, Linda's most audacious plan was already in motion, rewriting the future through fraud. In the wake of Joy Southeran's death, paperwork began to surface that would later serve as the smoking gun in a case defined by deception. Among the documents was a new will, allegedly signed by Joy in 2012, just before her death. This document significantly altered the distribution of her estate, granting a large portion of her assets to none other than Linda Rickard. The will immediately raised questions. Experts were brought in to assess its authenticity. A handwriting analyst concluded that Joy's signature had been forged. More than that, the will had not been witnessed according to legal standards, and the content strongly favoured the Rickards, people who had no prior claim to the family estate. Investigators determined that Linda had crafted and signed the fraudulent will herself, cutting out rightful heirs and inserting herself as a principal beneficiary. But Linda's forgery didn't stop with Joy's documents. Court evidence revealed that she had done the same with Anthony's will. In 2013, another will surfaced, allegedly signed by Anthony, again redirecting his estate to benefit the Rickards. Like the first, this will bore signs of forgery, handwriting inconsistencies, irregular witnessing, and content that conflicted with Anthony's previous documented intentions. Legal experts testified the documents were part of a broader pattern of manipulation. The forged wills were not isolated incidents. They were the legal arm of a calculated effort to transfer control of the Southeran estate. Linda Rickard had created and manipulated legal paperwork in a way that would only come to light after Anthony's death in 2014. At the center of the legal argument was the question of motive. Financial records introduced at trial showed that Linda was in significant debt during the time the documents were created. Her history of unpaid loans and court judgments provided a clear incentive. By forging the wills, she stood to gain a substantial inheritance, one that could permanently erase her financial problems. The timeline was damning. Joy Southeran died in August 2012. The forged will benefiting Linda was dated just weeks before her death. Then, in 2013, a similar will for Anthony was produced, following the same pattern. Both documents were conveniently discovered by Linda or provided by her to legal professionals, usually without verification from third parties. And both reflected drastic changes that excluded previous beneficiaries. Anthony's deteriorating condition made contesting the documents impossible. By the time suspicions were raised, he was physically incapable of defending his interests. His isolation and dependence had made him the ideal victim of estate fraud. The prosecution leaned heavily on expert testimony. Handwriting analysts, forensic accountants, and legal scholars outlined the full scope of Linda's deception. It wasn't just the content of the wills. It was the total control she exercised over the environment in which they were created. From controlling who Anthony spoke to managing his medications, Linda engineered circumstances where no one could question her narrative. In court, the forged wills became the centerpiece of a broader story, not just about fraud, but about how legal documents can be weaponized by those with access and intent. Linda Rickard's scheme had turned one of England's oldest and most protected legal tools, the will, into a means of orchestrating control over another person's life and death. What shocked investigators most wasn't only the forgery itself, it was how long the deception had gone undetected. For nearly 2 years, the Rickards lived on the estate, assuming control of its assets, while Anthony Southeran withered away in silence. By the time Anthony Southeran's condition drew the attention of authorities, the damage had already been done. Beneath the roof of High Haven's farm, what had begun as subtle coercion evolved into near-total control, one that would ultimately lead to his death. Linda Rickard, who had positioned herself as his carer, was not only managing his health needs, but controlling every aspect of his existence. In the months leading up to his death in March 2014, this control turned deadly. Evidence presented in court revealed a pattern of deliberate isolation. Linda Rickard restricted Anthony's access to medical professionals, delaying or cancelling appointments and creating barriers between him and the outside world. Witness statements and medical records highlighted how she frequently interfered with his healthcare, often under the guise of convenience or preference. She claimed Anthony preferred not to be disturbed. She insisted he disliked visitors. She gave excuses for his inability to attend appointments. These claims went largely unchallenged at the time, partly due to her perceived role as a trusted caregiver. Anthony's relatives and those connected to the family began to grow concerned. A former nurse testified during the trial that she found it increasingly difficult to contact him. Neighbors recalled how Anthony, once occasionally seen on the property, seemed to vanish entirely. Despite living on a large estate, he became a ghost within its walls. According to court testimony, Linda created a bubble around Anthony that filtered all communication, dictating who could see him and when. The once distant warning signs were growing louder. The most disturbing revelations emerged from the post-mortem examination. At over 6 feet tall, Anthony weighed just under 9 stone, approximately 126 pounds at the time of his death. Medical experts concluded that he died from malnutrition and dehydration, describing the condition of his body as consistent with prolonged neglect. His bones protruded through thinning skin. His internal organs showed signs of starvation. The court heard that the level of emaciation was akin to famine victims, but this was not a case of accidental neglect. Prosecutors argued that Linda Rickard deliberately starved Anthony over a period of time while controlling his medication and personal care. She had access to his meals, prescribed drugs, and even his bank accounts. The jury was told she monitored everything he consumed, keeping him thin, dependent, and weak. As his health deteriorated, Linda took no steps to intervene. Instead, she continued to isolate him, ensuring that no one else intervened as time slowly ran out. A local GP who had previously attempted to check on Anthony testified that Linda often deflected visits. When professionals did make contact, Linda managed the interaction so tightly that Anthony's true state was hidden. Her explanations, combined with Anthony's reclusive history, allowed the neglect to continue undetected. It wasn't just control, it was containment. And behind that containment, a man was slowly dying. On March 18, 2014, the illusion of tranquility at High Havens Farm shattered. It was on this day that Anthony Southeran was found dead inside the once proud Oxfordshire estate, in a condition that would appall even seasoned investigators. What had been carefully concealed behind closed doors was now exposed in full. A man who had been systematically neglected to the point of death, his body a grim testament to months of suffering. His lifeless frame weighed just under 9 stone, roughly 126 pounds, despite his 6'2" stature. The stark discrepancy between his height and weight painted a horrifying picture. Anthony Southeran had been starved to death. Authorities arrived at High Havens Farm following reports of Anthony's deteriorating health. When emergency responders entered his bedroom, they were met with a scene more akin to a neglected institution than a private home. The room was dirty and unkempt, the air thick with the smell of neglect. There was little in the way of proper bedding or medical supplies, no sign of regular hygiene, and no evidence that adequate meals had been prepared in recent weeks. The skeletal figure in the bed was not just malnourished, it was emaciated. The attending pathologist, Dr. Nicholas Hunt, would later describe the condition of Anthony's body in court. His ribs were visible through paper-thin skin. His hip bones jutted outward, and muscle mass had all but disappeared. The post-mortem revealed that he had died from a combination of malnutrition and dehydration. There were no signs of physical injury, only the silent, insidious effects of starvation over time. The body showed no recent food intake and a complete absence of stored fat. The findings were so severe that Dr. Hunt compared the physical state to victims of famine or wartime prison camps. Authorities were immediately alarmed. This was not a sudden medical event. This was a slow, preventable death. Detectives from Thames Valley Police were called in, and the investigation was quickly elevated from an unattended death to a suspected case of neglect and abuse. The inconsistencies in Linda Rickard's explanations raised early red flags. She claimed Anthony had refused to eat, insisting he was stubborn and difficult to manage. But medical professionals quickly dismissed the notion that such extreme weight loss could have occurred without deliberate denial of care. Family members, particularly those who had been distanced by Linda over the years, were horrified. Many had tried unsuccessfully to visit or contact Anthony in the months leading up to his death. They described being dismissed, ignored, or deflected by Linda, who claimed Anthony preferred isolation. In reality, his physical state would have made any visitor immediately suspicious. But by controlling access and curating a false narrative, Linda had kept his condition hidden until it was too late. A formal investigation was launched in the days following Anthony's death. Officers began combing through the property, documenting the environment in which he had lived and died. Photographs taken from inside the home showed signs of neglect and squalor, peeling paint, grime-covered furniture, and a room that resembled confinement more than comfort. Investigators began collecting medical records, financial documents, and personal correspondence, trying to piece together the chain of events that led to Anthony's death. In April 2014, just weeks after the discovery of the body, the coroner issued an initial finding that Anthony Southeran had died of malnutrition, setting the stage for what would become a years-long investigation into abuse, fraud, and ultimately murder. Detectives dug deeper into the Rickards' financial activities and daily routines. They interviewed former medical professionals, family members, and legal representatives connected to the Southeran estate. A clearer pattern emerged, one of calculated isolation, deceit, and intentional deprivation. Among the most telling pieces of evidence was the timeline leading up to Anthony's death. In early 2013, Linda Rickard began significantly limiting his access to outside care. Home visits from general practitioners dwindled, appointments were missed or rescheduled. Those who called to check on Anthony were told he was unavailable or unwilling to speak. Simultaneously, Linda was gaining control of his finances and manipulating legal documents. Anthony's physical decline was mirrored by his administrative erasure. Throughout this period, Linda and her husband Wayne continued to live comfortably on the estate. With no rent, full access to the property and control over Anthony's accounts, they maintained their daily lives while the man in their care wasted away. Forensic financial records later revealed that during the time Anthony was being starved, Linda was making purchases and transactions from accounts linked to the estate. By the summer of 2014, the police investigation intensified. Evidence of forgery, bank fraud, and medical neglect continued to mount. The Crown Prosecution Service began building a complex case that would include charges of murder, fraud, and neglect. Detectives described the investigation as one of the most detailed and harrowing of their careers. This wasn't just about theft or incompetence. It was about a pattern of behavior that suggested intent. In the aftermath of Anthony's death, public reaction was one of shock and disbelief. How could a man of means, living on a large estate in a developed country, be allowed to starve to death? The media began reporting on the case in fragments, revealing a disturbing picture of a vulnerable adult exploited in the very place he should have been safest. The circumstances surrounding his death defied public expectations about elder care, family protection, and legal safeguards. When Anthony Southeran's frail body was removed from High Havens Farm in March 2014, the evidence of physical neglect was irrefutable. But what authorities couldn't see in that moment was the intricate web of lies, manipulation, and financial exploitation that had quietly taken root long before his death. As detectives from Thames Valley Police began peeling back the layers of the case, they uncovered a chilling pattern. Years of carefully orchestrated deceit, bank fraud, forged legal documents, and medical obstruction that pointed not to a tragic oversight, but a calculated and sustained campaign of control. The investigation into Anthony's death officially opened as joint operation between the Major Crime Unit and Oxfordshire's Safeguarding Adults team. The pathologist's conclusion of death by malnutrition immediately raised red flags. It was during this transition that the relationship between Linda and Anthony began to shift. The one constant figure in Anthony's life in the final years, Linda Rickard. Detectives began by examining the financial records of Anthony and his late mother, Joy Southeran. Both had been individuals of substantial wealth, and both had employed Linda as a live-in carer. What began as a review of standard banking transactions quickly escalated when forensic accountants detected unauthorized withdrawals, irregular spending patterns, and unexpected legal document filings. Linda Rickard, it seemed, had not only manipulated Anthony's care, she had also hijacked his financial autonomy. Court evidence later presented by the prosecution detailed how Linda had accessed multiple bank accounts linked to the Southeran estate. Over a period spanning from 2012 to 2014, significant funds were funneled through accounts controlled or accessed by Linda. These were not limited to routine expenses or caregiving costs. They included personal spending, property maintenance that benefited the Rickards, and cash withdrawals with no corresponding receipts or justifications. In several instances, large transactions were authorized under dubious circumstances, often lacking verification signatures, or coming at times when Anthony would have been physically or mentally incapable of managing his finances. One of the most damning discoveries came in the form of forensic document analysis. Investigators retrieved wills that had allegedly been signed by both Joy and Anthony Southeran. These documents heavily favored Linda and her husband Wayne Rickard, granting them access to a considerable portion of the Southeran estate. But forensic handwriting experts brought in by the Crown Prosecution Service identified clear signs of forgery. Joy's signature was inconsistent with verified samples from legal documents she had signed before her death. Anthony's signature showed even greater irregularity, with investigators concluding he was unlikely to have had the physical or cognitive ability to sign such documents at the time they were purportedly written. Parallel to the financial investigation, police conducted interviews with professionals who had interacted with the Southerans during the final years of their lives. These included doctors, nurses, legal representatives, and even hairdressers, anyone who may have had access to Anthony or observed his condition. A disturbing pattern emerged. Linda Rickard had systematically blocked or redirected those who attempted to make contact with Anthony. General practitioners testified that appointments were frequently cancelled. One doctor reported being told by Linda that Anthony didn't want to be seen. Others described being given false updates about his health or denied entry altogether. Social workers and other care professionals echoed similar experiences. Linda was always the gatekeeper, always present, always speaking on Anthony's behalf. She claimed he was too ill or too tired or simply disinterested in speaking. In hindsight, these explanations were not protective. They were obstructive. Linda had created a barrier between Anthony and the outside world, so complete that few questioned it until it was too late. As police interviewed Linda and Wayne Rickard, the inconsistencies began to pile up. In her initial statements, Linda claimed Anthony was a recluse who refused food and social interaction. She insisted that he had full control over his decisions and simply preferred isolation. But under scrutiny, her version of events began to unravel. Investigators confronted her with medical records showing missed appointments, banking documents revealing unauthorized withdrawals, and testimony from professionals who contradicted her claims. Wayne Rickard's statements offered little clarity. He insisted he had no limited involvement in Anthony's care and claimed not to have noticed the severity of Anthony's condition. Yet, he had lived on the same property, in the same house, for years. Prosecutors later argued that his inaction and complacency were not just morally negligent, but criminally complicit. While Linda executed the manipulations, Wayne's passive presence allowed it to continue. A key moment in the investigation came when officers discovered handwritten notes and draft legal documents inside the Rickards' quarters at High Havens Farm. These included attempts to mimic signatures, unfinished versions of wills, and financial tracking that suggested premeditated planning. The materials not only confirmed forgery, they established intent. By 2017, after years of compiling evidence, prosecutors felt confident in building a case not only for fraud and forgery, but for murder. The decision was not made lightly. Prosecuting a murder by starvation, a method rarely seen in modern legal proceedings, required irrefutable proof of deliberate, prolonged neglect with fatal consequences. The financial evidence provided motive, but the forensic and testimonial evidence provided the mechanism. What had initially appeared to be the tragic death of a reclusive man was now understood as a slow and methodical erasure. The investigation had uncovered not just a failure of care, but a blueprint of exploitation. One that Linda Rickard had drawn, refined, and executed over the course of years. It took years of painstaking investigation before Linda Rickard finally stood trial for one of the most shocking crimes in recent British memory. In 2021, the courtroom at Reading Crown Court became the stage where truth would confront deception and where the slow death of a vulnerable man would be heard, loudly, finally, and publicly. Linda Rickard faced multiple charges: the murder of Anthony Southeran, fraud, and forgery. The Crown Prosecution Service argued that this was not a case of negligence, but premeditated murder by starvation, a rare and difficult charge to prosecute under modern law. Prosecutors contended that Linda deliberately withheld food, medical care, and support from Anthony over an extended period, while simultaneously forging documents to redirect his wealth into her control. They described it as a calculated campaign masked as caregiving. Wayne Rickard, her husband, was also charged, not with murder but with causing or allowing the death of a vulnerable adult, a charge introduced into UK law under the Domestic Violence, Crime and Victims Act 2004. Prosecutors said he knew what was happening inside the house, saw Anthony's condition deteriorating, yet did nothing to intervene. The Crown argued that while Wayne didn't orchestrate the plan, his silence made him complicit in Anthony's death. Throughout the trial, which lasted several weeks, the prosecution presented a devastating array of evidence. Medical experts testified that Anthony's death was consistent with deliberate and prolonged starvation. Financial investigators presented records showing that Linda had transferred or withdrawn funds from accounts belonging to both Joy and Anthony Southeran. Handwriting analysts detailed the falsification of wills, linking the forged documents directly to Linda. Legal witnesses, neighbours, doctors and nurses offered insight into the restricted access, the pattern of cancelled appointments, and the isolation Anthony suffered. Linda's defence insisted that Anthony was difficult, reclusive, and had refused food and care despite her best efforts. Her barrister argued that Anthony's death, while tragic, was not murder but a failure of circumstances. Wayne's defence claimed he had no control over Linda's actions and was unaware of the full extent of her behaviour. But the evidence spoke louder than any statement made in their defence. Surveillance of financial activity, consistent testimonies from medical professionals, and the emaciation of the body all left little room for doubt. Anthony Southeran had not prepared for death. He had been prepared for it. The jury returned a guilty verdict against Linda Rickard on the charge of murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years. Judge Mr. Justice Wall delivered the sentence with gravitas, calling the case a chilling abuse of trust and declaring that Linda had shown prolonged cruelty that led to a man's death through starvation. He emphasized the rarity of such a conviction and noted that this case would be remembered as one of the first modern British murder convictions based solely on intentional starvation. Wayne Rickard was also found guilty of allowing the death of a vulnerable adult. He was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison. The judge stated that Wayne's failure to act, despite living under the same roof and witnessing Anthony's condition, made him morally and legally responsible. Though not the architect, he had enabled the crime by doing nothing to stop it. The trial marked a significant moment in British legal history, not only for its unprecedented conviction, but for the attention it brought to the invisible forms of abuse that can occur behind closed doors. The verdict was not just about punishing the Rickards. It was about setting a precedent that systemic manipulation, prolonged neglect, and the slow erasure of autonomy through coercion and control could and would be treated as murder. The sentencing of Linda and Wayne Rickard offered a measure of closure, but even as the prison doors closed behind them, the questions remained. How could a vulnerable man, with a known inheritance and a known carer, slowly waste away without anyone intervening in time? The legacy of Anthony Southeran's death is not confined to one courtroom or one family. It echoes through social services, healthcare systems, and local communities, raising urgent concerns about the failings that allowed this crime to unfold. Experts across the country weighed in. Safeguarding professionals pointed to gaps in communication between healthcare providers and social services. Although there were missed appointments and reduced contact, no unified mechanism existed to escalate these red flags into an investigation. General practitioners had expressed concern, but in a world of patient confidentiality and bureaucratic caution, those concerns never translated into action. The Southeran family, left shattered by the revelations, voiced their heartbreak publicly. In a statement read at sentencing, relatives said Anthony had been imprisoned in his own home and died in squalor, alone and without dignity. They described the trauma of discovering the truth and the enduring pain of knowing his death could have been prevented. The village of South Newington was left stunned. High Havens Farm, once a quiet and stately estate, became a symbol of concealed horror. Residents who once waved politely at the gates were now reckoning with the realization that abuse, prolonged fatal abuse, had occurred just steps from their own homes. This case also sparked wider conversations about elder abuse, carer accountability, and the power of manipulation disguised as care. When trust is given without scrutiny, when gatekeeping is permitted without oversight, vulnerable individuals are placed at extreme risk. Linda Rickard's actions revealed just how easily control could be seized under the cover of routine caregiving, especially when the victim is isolated, dependent, and without regular external contact. In legal circles, the case will likely be studied for years. It set a precedent that murder doesn't always involve violence in the traditional sense. Starvation, when intentional and prolonged, can constitute murder under British law. That alone reshapes how courts may approach similar cases in the future. But beyond precedent and punishment, the emotional weight of the case remains. Anthony Southeran's life was marked by solitude, but his death has become a national warning. His story underscores the urgent need for stronger safeguarding measures, tighter oversight of carers, and greater integration of health and social care systems. For many watching the trial, there was a sense of justice served. But for those who loved Anthony and for those who failed to protect him in time, that justice came too late. His story now belongs to the public. And with that comes a responsibility to listen, to learn, and to act. Justice was served, but the scars remain. What do you think? Could something like this happen again? Share your thoughts below. If you've made it this far, your curiosity deserves a reward. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the next case might just be the one that haunts you for life.